Welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, Karl XI of Sweden spent the last 20 years of the 1600s pushing through three major reforms. He confiscated vast amounts of land previous monarchs had given to various aristocrats. He reorganized the armed forces to ensure a cheap standing army, and he made himself absolute monarch, sidestepping both the council and the Riksdag. Just a few years later, he died, and the absolute power to rule Sweden was inherited by his son, who was also called Karl. The problem, at least one of the problems, was that the new King Karl XII was only 15 years old, and he displayed all the maturity and self-control you expect from a teenager. Three of Sweden's neighbors decided this would be a great time to attack and take back what the Swedes had taken from them over the years. Episode 102, The Great Northern War. Before we start today, I'd like to bring up something that a listener pointed out in a message the other day. Much like Gustavus Adolphus, Karl XII of Sweden isn't completely unknown abroad, but internationally he's often known under the name Carolus Rex. So if you've heard about Carolus Rex, just know that he's the same guy as Karl XII. Anyway, back to the action. At the end of the last episode, Sweden's enemies got together and declared war, hoping to take advantage of the fact that the country's new autocrat was a child with very little impulse control. But before we get into the war itself, let's have a look at who these enemies were. First up, we have Denmark, and I don't think I have to explain to you why the Danes were eager to join an alliance against Sweden. They wanted revenge for all the wars they'd lost in the last 40 years, and to reclaim the territory they'd lost in those wars. Denmark was now ruled by Frederick IV, who had succeeded his father Christian V as late as the year before, in 1699. That means that he'd been king even less time than his cousin, King Karl XII of Sweden. The second of these enemies was Russia. This vast empire had recently got its act together and was now led by Tsar Peter I, known to history as Peter the Great. Not a good sign if you're on the opposing side. Russia was landlocked to the west at the time, and Peter wanted to smash through the Swedish possessions east of the Baltic Sea to open a window to the west and establish a port on the Baltic shores. It was a key part of his grand plan to reform Russia and to turn the country into a modern great power on the European stage. Russia in the late 1600s was still less technologically advanced than most European countries, and this included the country's fleet and army, even though they could, at least in theory, raise a huge fighting force if they set their mind to it. The third member of the initial anti-Swedish triumvirate was Poland, or Poland-Lithuania, ruled by Augustus II, also known as Augustus the Strong. Again, not the kind of nickname you want your enemy to have. Augustus, who was also the Elector of Saxony, because, why not, had been elected King of Poland only 4 years before. Augustus was a controversial king. His election had been violent, and senior members of the powerful Catholic Church in Poland, as well as influential aristocratic families, opposed him. Augustus hoped that the recapture of Livonia from Sweden would strengthen his position domestically so that he could move on with his reform agenda. He had great plans for Poland-Lithuania, and he wanted to start by turning it into an absolute monarchy, like so many other principalities in Europe at the time, including both Denmark and Sweden. But he was up against a formidable domestic opposition in the shape of the Polish nobility, and they made sure to throw as many spanners in his works as it took to sabotage those plans. Nonetheless, in 1698, he met up with Tsar Peter of Russia to draw up the plans for their attack on Sweden. Apparently, it had been an epic event, remembered not only for planting the seed of the conflict known as the Great Northern War, but also for its drunken decadence. The anti-Swedish plan was a good one, even though it may have been conceived under the influence of more than a little bit of alcohol. The three allies would attack simultaneously, forcing the Swedes to either divide their forces into units that would be too small to be useful, or to focus on defending themselves in only one place, and therefore giving up the two others. The fighting began when Denmark attacked Holstein-Gottorp in March 1700. Holstein-Gottorp wasn't a part of Sweden, but it was Sweden's ally, ruled by Karl XII's brother-in-law and drinking buddy, Duke Frederick, whom we met in the last episode. At the same time, the Poles marched into Livonia. It had once been a Polish possession, and they had a long-standing goal of taking it back. The third attack came in Ingria, at the eastern end of the Gulf of Finland, where the Russians invaded. On paper, things looked pretty grim, but the Swedes were lucky. Both the Danes and the Poles got themselves bogged down in pointless sieges, and King Augustus II of Poland also had to handle growing opposition at home as he was trying to fight the Swedes. The Russians weren't able to commit the whole might of their armed forces to the conflict either, because they first had to disentangle themselves from a previous war against the Ottoman Empire in the south. One who didn't dilly-dally, though, was King Karl XII of Sweden. He acted immediately to knock the three anti-Swedish allies out of the war, one after the other. First up on his list was Denmark. Instead of following the Danish army into Holstein-Gottorp, King Karl decided to go straight at the heart of Denmark, Copenhagen. By capturing the Danish capital, he expected to force the Danes to sue for peace, at the very least. Maybe he'd be able to achieve his grandfather's old dream of absorbing Denmark into Sweden, putting an end to Danish independence altogether. Some 16,000 Swedish soldiers had gathered in Scania ahead of the invasion, but to get them across the Øresund Strait, the king needed to bring the fleet around. But to reach the army from the naval base in Karlskrona, named after Karl XI, the fleet needed to pass through the Øresund Strait. The Danes knew this, of course, and had blocked the strait with their fleet. No fewer than 40 Danish ships guarded the strait, or at least they guarded the western passage. You see, between Copenhagen and Malmö, there's a small island called Saltholm, and it has always been the common knowledge that large vessels like the Swedish ships of the line could only pass west of the island, close to the Danish coast. The eastern passage was far too shallow, in most places less than 6 meters deep. So the Danes had concentrated their entire fleet in the western passage, and going there would indeed have been a suicide mission for the Swedes. So Karl XII ordered the Swedish fleet to take a chance and sail up the eastern side, close to Malmö instead. Everyone thought it was madness, but he was the absolute monarch, so the navy commander obeyed. On July 13th, the Swedish fleet, consisting of 38 ships, passed up the perilously shallow passage east of Saltholm Island. And the gamble paid off. No fewer than 33 ships managed to bypass the Danish blockade, and only 5 ran aground. Once in the Øresund, the Swedes linked up with the combined Anglo-Dutch fleet, and together they managed to keep the Danish fleet away, forcing them to retreat to Copenhagen. The English and the Dutch pursued them and put them under continuous bombardment, making sure they wouldn't be able to interfere with the Swedish landing operation. At 6 o'clock in the morning on August 4th, a cannon shot rang out in the light mist, signaling that the Swedish attack had begun. The soldiers boarded small landing vessels, while the larger ships fired at the Danish defenders on the beach. The attack was centered on Humlebæk, north of Copenhagen. When the first group of Swedish soldiers jumped into the water and started to wade onto the beach, the Danish cavalry attacked, hoping they'd be able to throw the Swedes back into the sea before they had a chance to establish a bridgehead. But those first Swedish soldiers had managed to keep their gunpowder dry and fired a volley at the approaching Danish riders while they were still standing knee-deep in water. The Danish troops retreated, leaving the beach open for the Swedes to land. Encouraged by the initial success of his troops, King Karl himself jumped into the water. As he waded to shore, the Danish bullets swooshed past him, and while his aides ducked nervously, the king is supposed to have said, "From now on, this shall be my music." It's a good story, and like so many other good stories surrounding King Karl XII, it's almost certainly not true. Nonetheless, it became a central part of the legend surrounding the man known as the Hero King. Whatever the king did or did not say as he reached the beach, his soldiers had soon established that bridgehead, and over the next 24 hours, their numbers in Zealand swelled to some 7,000. That meant that there were now more Swedish than Danish troops on the island, but they were still vulnerable. The Swedes had no cavalry and almost no artillery. If the Danes would have gotten their act together and carried out a focused counterattack with cavalry, it's very likely that they would have been able to drive the Swedish invaders out. but the Swedes needn't have worried. After the invaders had managed to land at Humlebæk, the Danish forces withdrew to Copenhagen in order to continue the defense there. The Swedes waited a few more days, but by the time 10,000 Swedish soldiers stood on Danish soil, they set off south toward the city. The plan was to lay siege to the Danish capital. The Swedes weren't planning on actually storming the city, though. Even Karl XII realized that would have been impossible. But he did hope that his cousin Frederick wouldn't dare taking the chance and instead surrender to the Swedes. And he was right. Kind of. On August 12th, already before he reached Copenhagen, the Swedish king received the news that Denmark had hurried to make peace with Holstein-Gottorp. According to the peace agreement, Denmark also promised to withdraw from the anti-Swedish alliance. After the brief and failed war, King Frederick IV spent the coming years licking his wounds. Instead of warfare, he focused on transforming Denmark along the lines of the reforms that had been so successful for Sweden. He was only partially successful. Karl XII, on the other hand, wasn't done with the fighting. Far from it. He was buoyed by his success in Denmark, true, but he kept receiving worrying reports from across the Baltic Sea. He hurried to get his army ready to be shipped to Estonia, which was a Swedish possession at the time. There, Finnish and Estonian regiments were getting ready to join the main army. Their aim was to meet the threat posed by the Russians, who had invaded Swedish Ingria. The Russian Tsar had brought an enormous army consisting of no fewer than 31 regiments, but they were poorly trained and many of them lacked experience. And when I say they lacked experience, I mean it. Some had been formed as late as a few weeks before they marched off to war against Sweden. To make matters worse, the Tsar had purged the officer corps that very spring, replacing experienced commanders with young aristocrats from Moscow who had never served in the military, let alone held real military commands. In November 1700, the Russians surrounded the Estonian city of Narva, which was an eastern outpost of the Swedish Empire on the border to Russia. Tsar Peter hoped that the city would surrender when it was put under siege, but the garrison held out, waiting for the Swedish main army to come and rescue them. And they didn't have to wait long. In the afternoon of November 29th, the Swedish army, under the personal command of King Karl XII, was approaching. The relief force didn't know if they'd arrived on time to rescue Narva, so the king ordered the Swedish salute to be fired. When he received the same signal back from the fortress, King Karl immediately started to prepare for battle the following day. Beside the king, the Swedish army was commanded by skillful and experienced officers who had fought wars both at home and abroad. On the Russian side, however, things were different. The commander of the Russian forces was a man called Charles Eugène de Croÿ, and as you may have guessed from his name, he wasn't a native Russian. In fact, he'd never even lived in Russia, and definitely not commanded any Russian military units before. He had been sent to Tsar Peter by his ally, King Augustus II, on a diplomatic mission only a few weeks before. That was the first time de Croÿ had encountered Russian troops up close. Since Peter didn't have any experienced officers left, he kept de Croÿ around, trying to convince the general to take command over the Russian troops. But de Croÿ wasn't interested. He refused the job several times, and only agreed after Tsar Peter had plied him with alcohol to stiffen his resolve. That wine-induced promotion took place the day before the Swedish cannons exchanged salutes, alerting the Russian camp that the Swedish relief army had arrived. So de Croÿ didn't have much time to prepare his forces, or even introduce himself to them. Even though de Croÿ hadn't commanded the Russian army before, he still was an experienced general, so he did what had to be done as the light faded that afternoon. He ordered the soldiers to make sure their weapons were in order and kept half of the army on high alert throughout the night, in case the Swedes would try some surprise move. Curiously, Tsar Peter himself had actually left the camp the day before, after having secured de Croÿ's agreement to take command. Historians have never really figured out why the Russian Tsar chose to leave at this critical moment. Maybe he didn't expect the Swedes to attack in the immediate future, since the Russian siege camp outside Narva was well fortified and the Russian army was far bigger than the Swedish one. Or maybe he assumed that even if the Swedes were to attack, his army would be able to withstand the assault easily. Some historians think that the Tsar, having judged the situation under control, left to make sure reinforcements were on the way, or to handle an urgent crisis with the supply lines, or perhaps to negotiate with his ally Augustus II, who had recently gone into winter quarters in Livonia. Other, more malicious people have chosen to interpret the Tsar's departure as a sign of cowardice, and at various European courts, Peter would be mocked for this decision. So even if he hadn't been too afraid of the Swedes to stick around, that was the impression the Russian Tsar gave, at least to his opponents. The following morning, at around 10 a.m., the Swedish army was getting ready to attack. Here, I'd like to insert a note about the calendar again. Remember that we talked about the gradual introduction of the Gregorian calendar and how the Scandinavians were reluctant to do so, since it happened to be introduced by a pope? So, according to the old Julian calendar, this was all happening on November 19th. But according to the Gregorian calendar, it was already November 30th. But that's not the end of it. In the year 1700, the Swedes were, for some reason, using a transitional calendar. So to them, it was November 20th. Whatever day it was, de Coey was observing the Swedes as they were deploying their troops. He noted with surprise that the force was surprisingly small. Karl XII only had about 10,000 men under his command, but de Coey, who commanded almost 4 times as many soldiers, worried that this wasn't the whole Swedish army at all, but merely the vanguard. He was worried that this might be a trap, and that the whole Swedish main army would suddenly appear at a later point from an inconvenient direction, threatening the Russian positions. In order to avoid being outflanked by the Swedish phantom army that de Coey assumed must exist, because it would be madness to attack a well-fortified defender who outnumbers you 4-1, the Russian commander ordered his army to deploy along a 6.4-kilometer long line. That meant that only a small part of the great Russian force would engage with the Swedish army at any one time. The terrain where the Russians deployed was also broken up and uneven, making it difficult to move in, especially for inexperienced troops like the Russians. In the middle of that long Russian line, there was a heavily fortified hill. Karl XII divided his troops in 2 parts, one north and one south of the hill. Grenadiers were placed at the beginning of the marching columns, and their job would be to break through the fortifications. The cavalry was deployed to protect the flanks to prevent the Russians from attacking from the sides or sallying forth from the fortifications ahead. The Swedish artillery was placed on a low ridge, and it was bombarding the points where the attack was supposed to take place. After 4 hours of maneuvering, the Swedes were finally ready with their preparations, and around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they were ready to attack. About that time, it started to snow. And not just some picturesque sparkling of pretty flakes here and there, but a full-blown snowstorm. Some Swedes suggested that they should probably postpone the attack, but the king wouldn't have it. On the contrary, he said, he thought it was actually a boon, since the wind direction meant the Russians had their snow blowing in their eyes. That way, the weather would actually help the Swedes. And so the battle began with an assault against the fortified hill. To begin with, the Russians defended their positions fiercely, but it didn't last long. As soon as the Swedish grenadiers reached the fortifications and broke through, the Russians lost their nerve. Within a quarter of an hour, the battle had turned into a massacre. Once the hill fortification was in Swedish hands, they split their forces into 2, one moving north and one moving south, rolling up that long but thin Russian line in both directions. The inexperienced Russian troops didn't stand a chance as they were attacked from their exposed flank. The Swedes moved quickly down the line, crushing the Russian regiments one after the other. The Russian soldiers panicked when they realized what was happening and soon turned their weapons against their own commanders. To save their lives, de Coey and his staff had no choice but to surrender to the Swedes as quickly as possible so that they would be protected from their own soldiers. Russian soldiers, gripped by fear, started to stream towards the only bridge across the Narva River. They hoped to find safety on the east bank, but soon the bridge collapsed under the weight of the fleeing Russians, and large numbers of them drowned in the icy waters. Only 2 of the 31 Russian regiments held it together and continued to fight the Swedes. They were found in the northern end of the Russian line, and as the Swedes were approaching, they hurried to set up improvised barricades with what they had at hand. Many of the Russian commanders joined this desperate last stand, despite the Croat's surrender. Karl XII led the attacks against this last Russian position personally, and even had a horse shot dead under him. Despite the king's presence, the first Swedish attack failed. The troops were exhausted and wouldn't be able to go on much longer. But they didn't have to, because the Russian commanders of that last position lost their nerve and signaled that they wanted to capitulate. For the Russians, the defeat at Narva was a catastrophe of epic proportions. It would take years for the Russian army to bounce back. For the Swedes, on the other hand, the Battle of Narva was a complete triumph, one of the greatest military victories in Swedish history, and in Stockholm there's still a Narva road cutting through one of the most fashionable neighborhoods of the city. Not only was virtually the whole Russian army obliterated, the Swedes captured all their artillery and their baggage train. In addition, no fewer than 10 Russian generals and many other commanders were captured. The victory at Narva was so total that it led the Swedes to underestimate the Russians in the years to come. And underestimating your enemy is something you do at your own peril during wartime. But at this point, Karl XII was riding high. Thanks to his decisive actions, both the Danes and the Russians had been beaten in just a few months. And now he turned his undivided attention and all his wrath at Poland and its king Augustus II. Well, if you want to get technical, and why wouldn't you, it wasn't Poland that was at war with Sweden, because Augustus the Strong hadn't managed to get the Polish nobility to agree to that. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had actually opted to remain neutral in the conflict. But Augustus was also the Elector of Saxony, and in that capacity he had declared war on Sweden and invaded Livonia. Karl XII tried to exploit the disagreement between the Polish nobility and their king, and declared that he had nothing against Poland-Lithuania. Nothing whatsoever. His beef was with the king, Augustus, and no one else, and so Sweden declared war on him personally, not the country he was king of. Karl XII even encouraged the Polish aristocracy to join him in his fight against their king. These diplomatic efforts were basically everything that happened for a few months, but by the summer of 1701, the two armies got going again after their winter break. The Saxons were expecting a Swedish attack and had used the winter to build up a formidable defensive position south of the river Duna. But when the Swedes attacked on July 9th, according to the Swedish calendar, they only suffered 100 casualties crossing the river. When the Saxons saw that they'd failed to stop the Swedes from reaching the southern bank of the river, they lost heart and their positions collapsed. Even though the bulk of Augustus's army managed to retreat, they still lost 2,000 men in the fighting. Augustus brought his army just across the border into his technically neutral kingdom, but when push came to shove, Karl XII didn't care much about technicalities. He ordered his army to advance into Poland-Lithuania, chasing after Augustus the Strong. His plan wasn't merely to defeat the King of Poland, but to oust him. That would remove a serious threat to the south, and if he'd managed to install a Swedish puppet on the Polish throne, this new guy could be used to threaten the Russians, thereby easing the pressure on Sweden's eastern border as well. The Swedish and the Polish Saxon armies met in two decisive battles, at Klishov in 1702 and Pultusk in 1703. The Swedes won both, and after that, Karl XII could make the Polish nobles convene in Warsaw in early 1704 in order to declare Augustus II deposed and to elect a new king. The leading candidate for the honor of becoming the Swedish puppet on the Polish throne was a guy called Jakub Ludwik Sobieski, but he was seized by troops loyal to Augustus before he could reach Warsaw. Jakub Ludwik would remain in prison for the foreseeable future, and that rendered him useless to the Swedes. Instead, they had another ally elected. On July 2nd, 1704, Stanislav Leszczynski was elected King of Poland. Stanislav then promptly signed a peace treaty with the Swedes that not only promised that Poland would join the war against the Russians on the Swedish side, but even included a clause granting rights of freedom of religion for Protestants in the deeply Catholic Poland-Lithuania. Needless to say, Tsar Peter of Russia wasn't particularly happy about this development. he wanted to reinstate Augustus on the Polish throne and sent a large military force to his aid. In the fall of 1705, around the time that Stanislav was crowned king of Poland, Peter and Augustus agreed to meet in Grodno to plan their next steps. Hearing about this meeting, Karl XII took a small force and advanced on Grodno as quickly as he could, hoping he'd be able to capture Augustus. But the news of the Swedish advance got out, and Augustus managed to escape the city together with a large cavalry unit. He wanted to turn the tables on the Swedes and attack them when they were far away from their main army. But thanks to some brilliant maneuvering, the Swedes managed to outsmart and defeat the numerically superior Polish force at the Battle of Fraustadt in February 1706. Augustus had brought 20,000 soldiers to the battle and lost 15,000. The Swedes, on the other hand, only suffered 400 casualties. After this decisive victory, Saxony was no longer a military threat to Sweden. Karl XII was free to focus on chasing out the Russian troops from Poland. Then he invaded Saxony and forced the Saxons to sign a peace treaty with the Swedes in September that year. Now, Augustus was forced to renounce his claim to the Polish crown and to recognize Stanislav as the legitimate king of Poland. Finally, Augustus also had to break his anti-Swedish pact with Tsar Peter. The treaty also included a clause that forced the Saxons to hand over the Livonian aristocrat Johann Reinhold Patkul to the Swedes. Patkul was a Baltic German nobleman who had lost a lot, both land and serfs, as a result of Karl XI's reforms. He'd found this deeply unfair, outrageous even. He objected to the reforms, first politely and then in a more insulting tone. Karl XI had been offended and sentenced him to death. Patkul didn't feel like dying, so he escaped to Poland, and it was he who had initiated the anti-Swedish alliance between Augustus II and Tsar Peter. When the Swedes got their hands on him, Karl XII made sure that the man who had insulted his father and conspired with the kingdom's enemies was executed by breaking him on the wheel. And if you don't know what that entails, I recommend that you don't Google it. Anyway, in 6 years, Karl XII had managed to defeat 3 major Northern European powers, Denmark, Russia, and Poland. Europe was paying attention. And among the people paying attention, the young Karl XII was increasingly turning into a legend. This change in status from brash teenager to heroic warrior king also had an effect on Sweden's international standing. Up until this point, Prussia had remained strictly neutral in the Great Northern War. But after the Swedish victory over Saxony, the Prussians agreed to an alliance with Sweden, possibly motivated more by fear of a Swedish invasion than by admiration for Karl XII's strategic genius. Then the Sun King himself, Louis XIV of France, also wanted to forge an alliance with the young Swedish king. He tried to convince Karl XII to join the French side in the ongoing War of the Spanish Succession. King Karl seems to have considered it, but the timely intervention of an English diplomat convinced him to keep out of that particular conflict. The Holy Roman Emperor had more luck. In August 1707, he signed an agreement with the King of Sweden, where he agreed to grant Protestants in Silesia more religious freedom. This agreement further boosted Karl XII's image as a force to be reckoned with. But the young King of Sweden wasn't interested in European glory. He wanted to crush his enemies. He wouldn't rest until the 3 original anti-Swedish allies were defeated. So far, he'd crushed Frederick IV of Denmark and Augustus II of Poland, but Peter I of Russia remained. So Karl XII decided it was high time to invade Russia. Now that Poland was pacified, it was time to march on Moscow and bring Tsar Peter to his knees. It should be easy enough. The Russians had been thoroughly beaten at Narva. But on the other hand, they had plenty of time to recover during Karl XII's side quest in Poland and Saxony. Would the Russians of 1708 be just as easy to beat as the Russians of 8 years before? Tune in next time to find out. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word among your friends who are also into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That's an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Life Hack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal, accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom, such as "Wake up early if you want another man's land or life," "Only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies," or "Speak useful words or be silent." Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop or if you just crave more content related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.